Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I'm just going to give everyone a minute or so to join. All right, hello and welcome to our 7th Ask Me Anything episode, Fight Back Against Active Attackers Automatically. Just a few items before we begin. Please be sure to submit any questions throughout the broadcast using the Q&A tab on the webinar call. We will be recording today's session, so be on the lookout for an email with the link later this week. With that, I want to hand things over to our host, Andrew, to introduce today's guest speaker and begin the AMA. Over to you, Andrew.
Great, thank you, Taylor, and welcome back, everybody. 7, we're doing good. It's definitely officially a series now. We're getting close to our 2-year anniversary. Taylor will have to come up with something really exciting for number 8. That's not to say that today's isn't really exciting, and it is for 2 important reasons. One of them is who I'm joined by. Fraser, thanks so much for joining us. You're one of the principal threat researchers in Sophos Labs, the beating heart that is Sophos, dare I say. Love to kind of hear a little bit from you. What does that mean? What does threat researcher mean in Sophos Labs? Where are you coming from today? And say hi to everybody on the call.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Andrew. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to join this webinar. It's cool to be here, and it's great to be talking about such an exciting feature as the one we're soon to discuss. I've been at Sophos for just over 17 years now, so a long time. It feels like a lifetime. When I started, my children were young, and now my children are definitely not young. Yes, I've in that time I've been within labs entirely, working in a variety of roles. Probably a decade or so ago, I did a lot of work with web threats when kind of web exploits were the thing of the day. But in the last kind of 8+ years, I've been working predominantly on behavioral protection. And so within Sophos Labs, the threat research team is the team that basically are responsible for obviously research into threats, but we work quite closely with our product teams to make sure our products deliver the relevant technologies that are required to protect, to classify, to provide visibility into all the bad stuff that happens across kind of customer networks, and fundamentally to give the ability for customers, for SOC teams to see what's happening and protect those networks and apply controls against those networks. There's never a dull day in labs. Sometimes it's sometimes infuriating. Sometimes you want a normal week where you can just kind of get through your planned list of work to do. But that's kind of one of the good and bad things of working in that sort of environment. There's attacks always come, interesting things always come, new technologies, new exploits. Yeah, it keeps you young, so I'm told.
No, you absolutely look great. I can't see any gray hairs at all. I'm not one to comment. And it's super interesting because I think if we talk to a lot of people at Sophos, there's a lot of, I don't want to say lifers, but there's a lot of us who've done a good amount of time. I'm just about to come up to 15 years, and it's pretty rare, honestly, in this industry where there is so much. I think Sophos is definitely an outlier of having all of these really seasoned folks. That's you, not me. I'm not calling myself seasoned. So I think it's really interesting as well, because one of the things that's happened in the industry over the last few years is there feels like there's definitely been a shift into detection first, and that kind of detection is a weird word, but identifying behavior after it's happened to give analysts a chance to go back. And I think the feature we're here to talk about, the active attack protection today, is one of those things that honestly, Sophos is really good at. We really excel at finding these complicated use cases and bringing in preventative detections, things that can stop attackers.
Yeah, that's very true. And it's funny you mentioned that kind of the detection versus protection angle. That's one of the bugbears that I often encounter when reading kind of press reports and things, because quite a lot of what you read in the market is people's detection capability. And so people, who read those articles, quite understandably often think, oh, okay, well, vendor X, they have the technology to protect against that. And it's like, well, no, that's not really the case, actually. So my heart, we provide both. We provide protection and detection or classification capabilities. My heart lies in protection. What gets me out of bed in the morning, what makes me kind of log on and do what we do. And this, I think this is true for most of the threat researchers we have, is writing rules, writing protection technologies that protect our customers from attacks, actively blocking those attacks and thwarting the attackers.
Fantastic, and you guys are doing a phenomenal job. I know SE Labs just published their most recent testing, and we were not only 100% in true positives, but also 100% for false positives, so 0 false positives. And I think that's something that often gets missed in these conversations. Which is kind of a great segue into starting with a little bit of a demo. I would love to, and this is where it always gets a little bit tense, demoing a feature to the person that dreamt it up and created it. So hopefully, Fraser, you think that this all goes okay. But that's kind of exactly the thing that we want to talk about. So for everyone watching, what you can see here is normal Windows 11 VM, not fully patched, but patched enough. It's recent enough. It does have the Sophos agent on there, and that's running in our default mode. And let's dig into that false positive element. So as an administrator, I have a number of tasks that I might need to do on a daily basis. Maybe one of those tasks is creating a new user and putting that user in the administrators group. And I need to be able to do that in a script, so I can go ahead and do that. Maybe one of the other things I want to do is download a file. So I might want to, when my clipboard works, let's try that again. No, the clipboard is not missing, is not behaving. Let's try this one other way. I think this is where I'm supposed to say, at least this proves that we're definitely doing it live. Let's try that one more time. It definitely worked the first time. Well, there's other tasks that I might want to do. Let's do this the old school way, and everybody watch me try and type and make typos at the same time. So one of the things I might want to do is look at my volume shadow copies. So I might want to run a command here that's going to go and delete the volume shadow copy area. Maybe it's gotten too big on this disk, and we know there's nothing of importance there. So I can go ahead and do that. We think it's really important for administrators to be able to do those tasks normally. But what happens when an attacker gets involved, and an attacker might do some other things that trigger other prevention elements, but maybe they've connected to this box through remote desktop. There's painfully too much exposed remote desktop to the internet. And here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to simulate with this little PowerShell script right here on the desktop. I'm just going to simulate what might happen if an attacker was to run enough commands that would make our agent decide that it was under active attack. And we're definitely going to dig into this a bit more and talk about some more of those things in a little bit. But I want to run this command. There we go. And of course, now I've done another typo. is it complaining because I didn't put it in capitals? All of this because my clipboard isn't working. There we go. Well, this is exciting for everyone. I apologize. Let's get us into PowerShell window here. And I'm just going to drag this down here. Let's open that script and let's just run that. And there we go. Right, so what you've seen there is one of our simulation tests. That's our behavior test there. So that's now triggered, and you can see it's gonna say that threats have been cleaned up. What that means is that an investigation has gone through, and it's confirmed that the PowerShell process was nothing that needed to be removed. PowerShell itself wasn't malicious. So let's jump up and try a couple more of those things. Let's see if we can run our VSS admin again. No, we can't. We get stopped with one of these disrupt rules. And if we go up and try our other user command here, we'll see that actually that user already exists because we created it earlier. So let's just go in and add another different user here. Of course, this is where something goes a little awry. There we go. So you can see there, trying to add that user into the local administrators group. That's also being blocked. So thanks, Clipboard, for messing us around a little bit there. It's kind of always the way. So I'm going to stop that screen share, and let's just chat through that, Fraser. Apologies for butchering your product there, but I think we got,
no, it's all good.
we got the idea across of some of the power. And what I think would be really interesting to everybody is to understand from a threat research perspective, two questions, if I may. How does this idea, how does the team have this idea, and how do you go about like building and defining how you want something like this to work?
Both very good questions. So I guess the concept itself was born in labs in response to the changes that we were seeing in the threat landscape at that time, so a few years ago. As we saw the shift away from kind of non-targeted or mass kind of attacks, if you like, towards these more targeted, persistent, and what we tend to call hands-on attacks. So just like you were hands-on in that demo, running commands, things were getting blocked, retrying, etc., etc. Exactly the same thing happens with these attackers in these kind of hands-on attacks. They typically use a combination of scripts. They deploy those scripts across multiple machines in order to kind of progress the attack and deliver whatever payload they're looking to deliver. And fundamentally, these attacks are where the attacker is determined to hit that target organization. In a non-targeted attack, they kind of, I guess people call them spray and pray. Some people fall victim to it and get hit. The people where that attack is successfully deflected, the attacker doesn't go back and retry something else, typically. But whereas in a targeted attack, there's that level of persistence that the attacker will keep on retrying in order to successfully attack that target organization. And so as we successfully defend attacks, the attacker will switch tactics, switch tooling in order to try and achieve their goals. And in those kind of situations where that organization did not have any sort of SOC team monitoring alerts, the attacker may eventually succeed. So that's the problem. So we developed the concept of, well, how can we do better? How can the endpoint automatically do better without any behavior change for the administrator, without any behavior change for the SOC team? And so we developed the concept of the endpoint automatically recognizing key indicators of attack that reflect this type of hands-on adversary attack. And in so doing, automatically adopting what you might call a shields up posture, essentially enabling an additional suite of behavioral protection rules that target not families of malware, not malicious behavior per se, but classes of behavior. And in your demo, you illustrated just a couple of those classes. So, deleting shadow copies. That's a behavior that is a perfectly benign activity, and you want administrators to be able to do that. But actually, in the context of a machine suspected to be under attack, it's quite reasonable to think of that specific behavior as, okay, that's probably ransomware authors looking to delete shadow copies off disk. Similarly, adding local new users and then adding them to the local admin group, again, that's indicative of attackers on the network as they look to elevate credentials, add new users, etc. That's indicative of what we commonly see in many types of attack. And so all of this is done with the intent to kind of delay and disrupt the attacker, which is good, obviously, because it makes it harder for the attacker, and fundamentally it buys the defender more time. And then the one thing I quite often forget, of course, is as you have these additional alerts that disrupt, I think it's 5A and 7C, they all begin with disrupt, just to make it easy. As you get those additional protection signals, they throw up even more signals for the customer, for the SOC, that make the attack even more obvious. So that, again, that plays to the defender's hand, and it's a bad thing for the attacker. Where the attacker wants to stay sub-radar, the more signals that you could throw up, the needle in the haystack becomes less of a needle in the haystack and more of a fire in the haystack, if you like. It's very obvious. You know, other technologies exist, and other people have technologies to kind of, for example, reduce the risk surface or lock things down. But the key advantage here is it's managed by Sophos Labs, and there's, well, I guess two key advantages. Firstly, by only deploying this shields up stance when we need it, it significantly reduces the impact for this type of capability on benign day-to-day activity. And your demo perfectly encapsulated that. So it's perfectly ordinary for IT staff to add local admin users. It's perfectly routine for IT staff to perform a whole suite of different commands. And that's the first advantage. And then the second advantage is as the attacks evolve and techniques change, different combinations of tools and techniques are used by different attack groups, as part of the ongoing kind of research and monitoring that we do within Sophos Labs, within our whole kind of global labs facility, you know, we can use that knowledge and apply it to this adaptive attack protection feature to ensure that kind of we keep up, basically, to ensure the capabilities of that feature remain relevant to the current threat landscape.
I think that's such a good illustration of the brain power that we've got in labs, just taking a step back and actually thinking through kind of the root cause.
Yeah.
One of the blessing and the curse of Sophos being a 38-odd-year-old organization is I think a lot of folks think of us as antivirus. So we're not out there making signatures anymore. I'm pleased I didn't trigger Fraser by using the word signature, but we are that's just so little, if anything, of the work that goes on in labs today.
Yes.
And actually, we've got a great question from Kevin that I want to get to, but seeing as I mentioned signatures, maybe you could just talk a little bit for us about signatures, that kind of concept of uniquely blocking a single file, maybe bust some myths for us about, is that a technology we still use, and is that something that we see as preventing a number of attacks?
Yeah, okay, that's a very good question. So signatures, as you rightly indicated, the blessing and curse of being kind of 30+ years old is we have a foot in a lot of these kind of what you might regard as traditional technologies, one of which is signatures. So when you say signature, it can mean different things to different people, but for most people, they tend to regard a signature as some blob of data that enables some scanner, I'll say, to basically recognize accurately and uniquely a specific file, a specific component. So in the simplest sense, you could say the file hash for a known piece of malware could be the signature. And so if you ever see that exact same file on disk, on the wire, going through a kind of a firewall appliance, whatever it happens to be, you can recognize it as malware and you can block it because of that unique signature. The reality is things aren't quite so simple as that. Sometimes signatures aren't the entirety of the file from beginning to the end. Sometimes a signature could be some signature blob of data that represents the key piece of functionality of a particular piece of malware. So a single signature might actually detect not just one specific file, but 3, 4, 5, 50, 100, 1,000 different variants of the same specific threat. But the intent is still that signature covers that particular family of malware. As technology has advanced over the last kind of 15 or so years, certain players have entered the market with certain types of technology, and on a marketing level, there's been a bit of a push towards some vendors kind of almost declaring signatures as legacy. They have no place in today's security world. Actually, that's not true at all. Signatures still have a really important part to play today. If you think about what we do in the labs, we aim to protect our customers from threats. That means in an ideal world, we proactively block every threat that ever is going to hit any of our customers. And so no customer gets hit by malware. And we do that in a surprisingly high percentage of cases. So threats that we've never seen before, with our behavioral protection, with our mitigations we have, for example, in our Hitman Pro capabilities within InterceptX, we can proactively defend against lots of new things that we've never seen before. But actually, in reality, a significant part of protection is also about mopping up the known bad. So as known bad files come in, signatures provide a very efficient way of recognizing those things very early on and just outright blocking them. And so, signatures play a significant part in the whole security story today. So we talk about layered protection, which again is a bit of a loaded marketing term, but it's about using a suite of different protection technologies in conjunction with each other to overall provide, good levels of protection. And so, well, that's why when we see testing bodies that test security products in a realistic way, that's very pleasing, because they're not just exercising suites of signatures alone. They're exercising a combination of signatures, behavioral protection, exploit mitigations. They're exercising the whole capability of that product in order to assess which product provides good levels of protection against realistic threat scenarios.
Fantastic. We haven't had any questions yet about testing, but I'm sure we will now that you've brought testing up. That's a really good segue though into Kevin. Kevin had a really interesting question for us, asking about kind of how the AAP feature works on systems where IT support isn't available immediately. It wants to make sure that it's something that's automatic, and what do the notifications for that look like?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So of all my skills, acronyms is not one of my key skills, and sophos love acronyms. And so this particular feature is called Adaptive Attack Protection. And so the adaptive part of it is basically around the fact that this feature enables the endpoint to automatically adapt, to automatically adopt that shields up posture. So if you as a customer have our product deployed, and that product is running with recommended settings within our kind of cloud console that manage the product configuration, this feature will be enabled by default. And when that endpoint recognizes that it's under attack, it will automatically adopt this shields up stance. So for you as the admin, there is nothing you need to do to activate this feature, if you like. Now, in the ideal situation, if you think about to what I said in terms of what this feature is designed to combat, it's that aggressive, persistent attacker. As we block things, adopt a shields up stance, block more things, the attacker isn't just going to run away. At some point, the idea is we buy time for the defender, ideally a skilled SOC team or similar, to step in and get the attacker off the network, identify the root cause, and then progress beyond that attack. But the feature itself will certainly just work on systems without any intervention or actions required on the IT support staff. And in terms of what it looks like from the management console, as we saw on your little demo, when those disrupt_rules fire, that indicates that we're in the shields up stance and we're actively blocking classes of behavior that we believe are associated with a likely hands-on active adversary that's on that machine.
And I know our audience. We're all nerds here. This is famously a safe space. If anyone else started thinking, automatically bringing the shields up when an attack is detected. That sounds an awful lot like something that happened in Star Trek Enterprise. We're not saying you stole the idea, Fraser. We're just saying maybe Chief Engineer Malcolm there, inspired this one just a little bit. We've done quite well. That is 25 minutes before a sci-fi reference. That could be a new record.
Pretty good.
Prepare yourselves, everyone. Let's talk a little bit about how our current customers can make use of this. So Vic asked, I'm already using the Sophos endpoint. How do I deploy this feature? How do I get this feature sent out onto all of my my systems? And we had another question come in and say, is this part of an existing endpoint license, perhaps the Intercept X Advanced license that some customers might be running?
Yeah, so by default, this feature is on and enabled. So within your product configuration, if your health check is green, nice big green tick or circle, whichever it is, then this feature will be enabled. If you, for whatever reason, happen to have disabled either this specific feature or behavioral protection, that will be highlighted in the health check within Sophos Central itself. But in a normal scenario where the product is running with default configuration, the feature will be enabled and active on all of your Windows endpoints.
That is a great plug for the account health check feature, which I'll just mention in a little bit more detail here. Yeah. So for any current Sophos users that aren't aware, when we get to the end of this webinar, go log into Sophos Central. Don't do it now. We've got way more interesting questions. But as soon as we get wrapped up, go log in and you'll see right up at the top something called account health check. If you go in there, you will see a high-level score for your overall health score. And then you'll see some other scores for making sure that all of the components are deployed across all of your systems, making sure that tamper protection is enabled everywhere it needs to be enabled, and looking into policy for any items which are recommended to be turned on, but that aren't turned on. And lastly, looking through all exclusions to see if there's any particularly concerning exclusions, things like whole drives being excluded from the scanners. Go check those out. There is a fix automatically button that you can opt to use. I always recommend understanding a little bit more about what that's going to do. That's going to revert that setting back to best practices, but it's a really useful feature to get at a glance. I know we don't typically talk about futures, but I'll mention one other futures piece, and there's some trending coming to that a little bit later this year. So you'll be able to see, well, when I first looked at it, I had a score of 80, and now I'm a month or so down the line, and I'm up at 90. So you'll be able to have some proof of improvements in there. I always love to see those kinds of reports.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And actually, I can just quote somebody who works in one of the incident response teams said to me today, just as he was talking about some recent ransomware attacks. I think and he stated in all the recent attacks he saw where there was successful file encryption, in each case it was non-compliant configurations on those devices, features turned off or global exclusions that had basically neutered the protection capabilities. So yeah, it's a really useful feature in Central.
And if anyone wants more information, connect with your Sophos team. They would be more than happy to spend some time, go through some of those in more detail with you. Let's jump over and kind of speaking of active attackers, one of the questions that came in from Mark asking what tools does Sophos provide to quarantine an attacker and kind of what do those notifications look like? I'll mention just one piece, and then Fraser, I think you've got something interesting for everyone. So if you're using XDR, if you have a Sophos CIXA XDR, Central Intercept X Advanced plus XDR license, we love acronyms and we love long names of products. If you're using that, we call it CIXA XDR to save 20 more minutes on the rest of this session. You'll see a button there called Isolate. So you're able to apply an isolation policy to individual systems There's also an API that would let you do that for multiple systems. There's exclusions to that, so you can allow your own Bastion hosts or jump hosts to connect through whichever protocol you might want to those systems. They maintain management capability to Sophos Central as well. But Fraser, I know I just said we try not to talk about futures, and I'm gonna ask you to talk about one thing that's close, and then one thing that we're maybe thinking about, which is, we know in policy today, you can say if a system goes from that green checkbox in a check in a circle over to red, automatically isolate it. But I think for AAP and for isolation, there's some interesting things we're thinking about.
Yeah, there's a few things we're always looking to evolve the capability itself. So the first thing to think about is, so isolation, as you said, you can define your own rules and exceptions, and an isolated box maintains connectivity to Sophos management servers to get updates, etc., and report back to central. But in some cases, that's still too blunt a tool for certain organizations to widely deploy. So one of the things we're currently researching and investigating is, within our shields up rules, can we more accurately recognize the specific call home IPs, and specifically within the rules block any process connecting to those known call homes. So that's kind of a dynamic feature that will just come for free as and when we have that capability within our rules. One of the other things that's risen since we initially shipped this feature is, today, when a box flips over into the shields up stance and takes that aggressive posture, there's no visibility to that itself. The visibility you get today is when the subsequent disrupt rules start firing, you obviously see those within central. And so one of the things that's currently being worked on is making the audit trail much more visible for when a device flips into this mode. And also, as part of that, making it possible for the SOC team to actually choose to push a device or a group of devices into AAP mode themselves. So if the SOC team deem it's appropriate, they can opt to flick a device or group of devices into AAP mode and enable that kind of more aggressive rule set. So that will be quite exciting.
Yeah, I know. I'm sure all the analysts on our own SOC team are really excited to be able to get their hands on that.
Yeah.
I think that's also a really good way to get in. We had one question, and some of you may have noticed when I pulled up that PowerShell script, I kind of moved it real quick. That was just some internal code to trigger that simulation detection for us. We've been asked to talk more about the content of that. That itself is super boring. So I'm gonna take a little license from that question and say, you talked about the adaptiveness of the policy here. Are we going to publish like a KB? Are we going to list out like, hey, here's all of the behaviors that could trigger shields up?
No, next question, please. But in all seriousness, actually, to many people, that's the kind of $64 million question. We get that asked a lot. And for obvious reasons, we aren't going to publish the exact criteria that causes us to adopt that, because that gives the attacker an advantage, or it gives information to the attackers that would help them in an attack. So we keep those cards pretty close to our chest. But what I will say is that we're, as part of our behavioral protection capability, we're looking at events that are triggering on the machine. The combination of those events within the context of what's happening on that machine enables us to determine when we consider a machine is most likely under attack. So even if I gave you, however many criteria right now that lets us consider a machine's under attack, next week it might be different, next month it might be different, because as I said at the start, one of the advantages of Sophos Labs managing this is actually, as our global kind of facility tracks all the threats that we're seeing, we can keep up to date with how the attackers evolve. And they do evolve. We see, people will have read news articles concerning certain attack groups. So, for example, Lockbit ransomware, Conti ransomware, now gone, but popped up in another space elsewhere. These attack groups, they tend to have playbooks. They tend to have scripts, techniques, strategies that they tend to run through. And so those playbooks evolve, and they evolve in direct response to some of the things that the defenders do. We know that because sometimes when they deploy their playbooks, they have certain file names with very rude file names that are critical of the security vendor that they're getting frustrated with. So yeah, so in short, you know, it's not singular events. The real kind of the real value of this capability is the ability to look at combinations of those events to recognize kind of in a very selective, carefully curated way when do we have a sequence of IT admin activities? When do we have a sequence of activities that are probably just a build server doing its regular stuff? And when do we have something that's indicative of a possible hands-on active adversary?
Fraser's being a little modest there as well when he avoids getting us an FCC or an Ofcom violation for the US and UK crowds. The only examples I have ever seen, I'm sure there are others, but the majority of examples I've seen have been cursing expletives about sophos.
Yes,
we had James Wilson on, I think, back on AMA number 4, I think, and I had to remind him it's a family show. So thank you for not not risking any offending any of our audiences right here. We got a really interesting question that came in, and again, I'm going to interpret this a little bit. I hope for the asker that I get this right. I think they're talking about their PowerShell execution policy and saying that their PowerShell policy is that only signed scripts are allowed to run. For AAP, but I think it's worth like taking a step back and thinking for all of the other technologies that we have, AMSI and the other behavioral things, are we paying attention to like the execution policy for PowerShell itself? Are we looking at whether scripts or even applications are signed, and if those signatures are correct, to kind of help feed into that decision-making engine?
We are, and I guess the key thing to say there is the presence of a validly signed script or a validly signed driver, executable, DLL, whatever. It's a fact, but it's not a license to just a green light to just proceed. It gives us some information about the file and the origin of that file, where it's come from, but it doesn't tell us that that file is legitimate. So history is full of signed malware or certificates that have been compromised and then used to subsequently sign malware. And so the presence of a certificate itself is just one of the ingredients that kind of, I guess, flows into our kind of big decision-making bubble to come out with a verdict of whether something's trustworthy or not and whether it's allowed to continue. Speaking specifically about PowerShell and signed scripts, a PowerShell signed script can still perform malicious activity. And so, you know, we will still, through AMSI, we will still monitor exactly what behavior we see PowerShell performing when a signed script is run. I'm not saying it's not a good idea to restrict your environment to only run signed scripts. I'm just saying the fact that you do that doesn't mean PowerShell, big green tick, nothing bad can happen via PowerShell. That's one of the, I guess, dangers of considering signed things.
Yeah, and certainly it's always really interesting to see, especially with a recent kind of spate of supply chain compromises where there's stuff that's injected before the signing phase. So it's happily off doing its bad things. We both talked about AMSI. Could you give us the 1-minute primer on what is this AMSI thing? For once, it's not a sophos acronym, so we get to blame someone else for the abbreviation.
Yes, so it's an anti-malware scan interface. So it's an interface provided by Microsoft on the later operating systems, which gives an observation / interception point for certain technologies on that box. So we spoke about PowerShell. So for example, if you run a PowerShell script where, let's suppose it's a PowerShell command, for example, where there's maybe a base64 string within the command line, and that base64 string, when you decode it, will contain PowerShell commands. Through AMSI, you would get visibility into the buffer that's produced when that string is decoded. If it's a kind of maybe some sort of malicious PowerShell script with multiple levels of encoding, through AMSI, you'll get inspection points as the PowerShell runs, as those different layers of encoding unwrap themselves. So it's a very powerful way for us to track malicious activity through certain mechanisms. So PowerShell is one example. Office VBA is another one. So when suspicious APIs or suspicious script activity is observed from Visual Basic for applications, so the macro language that's embedded within Office, when there's certain triggers, again, there is buffers of data presented to the resident scanner, so in our case sophos, to inspect that content and potentially block it before it's allowed to run. Other example are .NET. .NET is a whole minefield of dynamic execution, building, fileless opportunities, and again we get the visibility to, one of the most common kind of attack points when we talk about .NET is reflective injection. So the ability for the bad guys to have some sort of blob. It could be ASCII, it could be a binary blob that represents their payload, and rather than writing it to disk and trying to run it, they'll reflectively inject it into an existing process. And again, through AMSI, we get some visibility into that type of behavior. So it's I spoke earlier on about the layered protection story. AMSI is one example of that layered protection story. So from a Microsoft perspective, it's good to them because it provides a consistent interface for the security products to try and intercept bad stuff, without those security products having to build their own weird and wonderful hooks to achieve the same.
As if there weren't enough scripting things happening inside of the Office suite. I think I saw an announcement this week that Microsoft is bringing Python into Office, but they're going to run it on their own systems in Azure. That seems like somewhere that I'm sure some cogs are turning in the threat research team of like, that's an interesting way to open up a whole new type of attack.
Yeah, what can possibly go wrong, I think, is the appropriate response there.
Yes. I'd love to combine a couple of questions here. One of them is super interesting, and the other is kind of a little more on the technical product side, but I'll throw them both at you in kind of one thing. So we talked about how hands-on keyboard attackers, someone asked, don't a lot of attackers try and uninstall security tools, like as soon as they get onto a system? What are we doing, I think, to prevent that for our own tools, but potentially where we sit alongside other tools, and that's probably going to be Defender for endpoint. What are we doing for visibility there? So I'll give you that one, and then we'll come back with a little extra bonus question.
Yeah, okay. So that topic falls into the general umbrella of impairment. So a lot of what we talk about nowadays, we tend to use the MITRE framework. So I'm not an absolute fanboy of the whole MITRE framework, but I'll tell you what it does do. It provides a pretty good taxonomy where people can talk about different phases of an attack and different types of techniques and different types of tactics. And so I think in this concept, this very much falls under the kind of the tactic of impairment. So bad guys looking to impair the resident security product. So I've touched on a variety of things. So obviously, yes, that's something we're very interested from a behavioral perspective, but actually at a level higher than that, you already mentioned it earlier on when you talked about the health check within Central. One of the key items that's checked within that is a feature called tamper protection. And so that's a feature where, again, we advise all customers have it enabled, where our product is resilient to attack. So if somebody tries to terminate one of our kind of key processes or stop one of our key services, they're simply not allowed to do so because our core driver prevents them from doing so. If somebody tries to modify our configuration settings by modifying certain registry settings, again, that action is blocked. And so tamper protection is a really important feature to have enabled. And not having it enabled makes it easier for the bad guys to succeed in some sort of impairment attack. So that's one side. The second side is within our behavioral protection rules, we are also looking for techniques that are used to impair not just us, but also other security products, for example, Defender. And they can be quite varied, the different types of techniques that surface. And it's a very, I guess it's a bit of a holy grail for the attackers when they discover new ways of defeating a resident security product. They like to make lots of noise about it, and we get lots of kind of resulting questions based on it. So some of those things might be, for example, process or service oriented. So they're looking to, through some tool or through some action, kill one of our required services. Recently, over the last kind of 12 months, we've seen a massive increase in the use of legitimate but vulnerable drivers. So these are low-level drivers. Typically, they are drivers that are benign, they are signed, and they are part of a product suite where that product was designed to do some perfectly legitimate functionality. It could be associated with a display driver, it might be something to do with the network, whatever it happens to be, but the driver itself actually has the capacity to disable other drivers in the system. And then it's it can be a little bit of a an arms race to see which driver gets in first, to see can that driver disable the security product driver. And so again, within our behavioral system, we have rules that specifically look for the abuse of such drivers and block their use through a combination of technologies. We, in some cases, we outright block them based on the file itself. So in scanning the driver, we'll just block it by default. In other cases, when somebody actively tries to use that driver, actively tries to load it on a system, we block at that point there. And as I said, yeah, we've seen an increase in those kind of attacks. But again, from a defender standpoint, when we see somebody trying to load a driver we know is being used in certain attacks to kill the security product, that's a massively powerful and high-risk signal. So in some ways, when they try to do that and we block it, we know straight away, someone's trying to kill us. That's a on a scale of 1 to 10, that's an 11. And so that's a really good signal to us. And again, within our shields up stance, when we deploy those aggressive rules, we take a much more aggressive stance on what drivers are allowed or not allowed to be loaded. And we're much more aggressive in blocking them. I can't remember the exact number of drivers that were on the, there's a whole public project that kind of catalogs the drivers that are known to be have the capacity to be abused by the attackers. But it's not tens, it's not hundreds, it's in the tens of thousands of different drivers. It's a huge list.
So even more importance on back to those layers, back to
exactly
chances to disrupt all of that stuff. So philosophical.
I would say that type of capability, that type of protecting against that kind of abuse is bread and butter work. That's a lot of what we do in as part of regular threat research. It sounds frightening. It sounds like this great big horrific problem for which there's no solution, but actually it's just another day in the office. That's what we do.
Love it. Fraser can't be phased with the rest of the labs team. And the really interesting kind of philosophical follow-up was, if someone has hands on keyboard, especially if it's in the UI, if they're not just running playbooks through a remote command and control, where did we land on saying maybe popping up a disrupt notification to someone is letting them in on the fact that we can see them, versus kind of making some of that stuff active but silent from a UI perspective? Love to understand, like, what was there any thought process in that?
I've never been asked that question, but it's a good question. Yeah. So I guess fundamentally we have to strike the balance, and I think the root of the question is there's a very good point being made. Let's suppose the the pop-up that happens had a big button there saying, click here if you think this alert was not necessary or this was benign activity, and clicking there resulted in that behavior block being suppressed. That would clearly be a very bad thing, because the attacker who's physically at the UI would have the ability not just to see what's being blocked, but they'd also have the ability to say, actually, do you know what, let's unblock that, let me carry on, please. That capability isn't there. It's a notification capability. The capacity for the behavioral block to be authorized is only possible from someone who's authenticated in Sophos Central, and that is either the SOC team or the administrator. And again, we implore people to enable MFA within Central itself to protect their kind of crown jewels of product configuration. And so we have to strike a balance. You could also argue that if we're just silently blocking stuff and there's literally no notifications on the endpoint itself, it's I can see people complaining about that as well. So we have to strike the balance somewhere in the middle. And actually, what we display in the endpoint is fairly unobtrusive. It's a small pop-up, threat detected, typically then shortly followed by a threat cleaned, and then the state goes back to green. And so it's fairly unobtrusive. But fundamentally, when the attacker's running through a playbook of commands, if they run a command and there's absolutely no pop-up, but that command just turns back with an error message saying, whatever, command not successful, process blocked, whatever, they get it, they'll naturally assume a security product or some policy configuration is stopping that command working. And so they'll naturally pivot to an alternate strategy. So yeah, I think we've got the balance pretty much right, I think.
I think so too, because I think, like you said, those are really useful for end users just to understand, like, oh, it's not me. I'm not gonna just keep trying this thing, and then it becomes a different conversation with technical support, with the organization's tech support.
Yes. Exactly.
We had an interesting kind of product question. This is one of those times I'm going to take a stab at answering this question while looking at Fraser's face to see how he reacts to my answer. So we'll see if I get this right. Question around false positives. If there is a false positive, not just, I'm going to widen this as well to not just for AAP, but for any of those layers. What's the best way to react to that? For me, it's always a three-step process. The first step is investigate. As Fraser mentioned, we see a lot of stuff that looks legitimate, that's signed legitimately, carrying out bad stuff. So the first step is always, let's be sure it really is a false positive. I was chatting with one of the analysts on the MDR team, and they coined the phrase of, like, it's Schrodinger's detection until it's been investigated. Like, it's just a detection. Even if it's PowerShell, that doesn't mean it's definitely a false positive. So step one, always investigate. Step two, if you are convinced that it is a false positive, add the correct mitigation in policy to get your business up and running again. That's the best first thing. Scope that to be as narrow as you can, but add it in there, get back to business. And then the third part, escalate it up to Sophos Labs, who can bring it to the attention of Fraser's team to say, hey, this is something that we've seen. We're convinced it's a false positive. We want to give that data to labs to build into the next round of engineering that goes on in labs. Fraser, how was that?
I think that was a very good answer. Yeah, no, it's very good. I mean, as you said on the second part, the get your business back up and running. So within Sophos Central, we make it possible for behavioral blocks to be authorized. And so when we author a rule, we specifically associate some blob of data with every instance of a rule hit. That blob of data is the thumbprint of that particular block. And we naturally lead people, if they want to exclude or / authorize that particular protection event, we lead them towards authorizing that thumbprint, which naturally narrows the scope to that particular instance. But yeah, that was a very good answer.
And oh, thank you much. I'll keep that one. I'll keep that one in rotation. And you'll see, yeah, from the alert in central, scroll to the right, and you'll see a details button that will have all of that stuff right in there. We're getting close on time. I'd love to give you one quick question, Fraser. Maybe not quick as just exactly saying what percentage of attacks do you think we're seeing as PowerShell being an early tool used in that attack, but maybe you could just talk a little bit about kind of where we see PowerShell being used kind of through the kill chain.
Okay, so maybe it's okay if I broaden it from PowerShell to kind of lol bins, so living off the land. So I'm sure lots of people have heard this already, but living off the land is the concept is rather than bringing the knife to the knife fight, the attacker is using the knives that are already on the systems. So PowerShell is one such knife. That's a particularly large, sharp, and dangerous knife. But there's lots of other ones as well. Cert util. There's a whole bunch of different binaries that are present on practically every single Windows box ever that could be easily abused by the attacker. And so in most times when we talk about an attack chain, we're basically talking about the sequence of steps that happen between initial access, the starting point of the attack, right through to the pulling the trigger on the payload, be it ransomware, data theft, whatever it happens to be. And that sequence of steps, again, if we kind of adopt the MITRE taxonomy, are steps around discovery, steps around lateral movement, privilege escalation, credential theft. And why is PowerShell such a vital and useful and powerful administrator tool? Because actually PowerShell, its commandlets, the way it can be used, it's very powerful in all of those kind of capabilities. It can be used to string together chains of applications, perform commands natively to basically let you more easily discover, probe other machines on the network, configure each machine you might get access to. You know, PowerShell is very much a core component of, I don't have an exact number, but I would say in the majority of hands-on attacks, there will almost certainly be lol bin usage. And in most of those, there'll be some PowerShell will typically be there. I'd be surprised if there wasn't multiple lol bins used as part of that chain. And we should probably also consider not just the kind of the lol bins, the applications and the utilities that are present on all the machines, but also the potentially unwanted applications that get frequently abused on these boxes. So PUAs, potentially unwanted applications, another acronym. This refers to benign software that we know that the attackers have in their playbooks and use in their attacks. So these are knives that they bring to the fight, but they're legitimate knives that, you know, by default, no security product will block. And technologies like the PUA capability and the application control capabilities within our product suite give people the visibility and the ability to control these legitimate applications where they have no place within a particular organization's environment. So, you know, having good control over such applications is a really good way of reducing your risk surface. So, you know, for customers that are looking to talk to our MDR teams about what can they do to generally improve things, that itself is a really good conversation point where the MDR team can provide great insight into how, you know, again, it's another one of these legacy technologies, application control. We've been doing it for 20 plus years. It's still as relevant today as it was 20 years ago. Even though it's not kind of hot and sexy and all the rest of it, it's still a really core kind of part of what we do and part of a good security stance.
It absolutely is. I love app control. We'll talk about that in just a second, but you brought up MDR, and that's the perfect question to go out on. So the person that said you're using the top tier MDR provider, I assume you mean Sophos, because we're actually the world's largest MDR provider. More organizations trust Sophos to deliver MDR. I mean, full marketing. Sorry, Taylor, for stealing the marketing spiel, but it's true. More than the two other, the biggest competitors you're thinking of, we have more customers globally. So in as quickly as you could, Fraser, how do organizations test and get good, valid testing? Is it something an organization could do themselves, or really, should they look to trust some of those third parties like SE Labs and like MITRE for some data points when they go through those studies?
I personally, I don't think it's realistic for customers, even large organizations, to be able to test the protection and the classification or detection capabilities of security products in-house. I would use those trusted third-party test organizations that invest a huge amount of time and skill set into having reproducible, fair test scenarios where they kind of highlight advantages and disadvantages of one product versus other products, and have done for months. And again, on that same note, don't look at one specific test. Don't look at the July 2023 test. Look at how a product has performed. Let's suppose they perform the tests on a quarterly basis. Look at kind of 12 months, even 24 months of how those products are performing, which products consistently rank highest. Don't necessarily just shoot for first place either. I mean, even if we sit in first place in a test, actually, it's a perfectly fair comment to say that, any product which is badly configured is the worst product. And so it's not just about the kind of the raw capabilities of that product. You want to look at a product with a good level of capability, but then, okay, ask questions and have a look at the management console. Can I effectively manage this within my organization? Am I going to utilize a third-party SOC team, sophos, MDR, whatever, to manage this in my environment? Will they have the visibility they need? All those are kind of good questions in choosing the best product. But typically, I would use those kind of third-party trusted test organizations to pluck out the best performing products to choose from.
That is fantastic. Fraser, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for everything that you and Sophos Labs does to keep all of our customers safe out there. To anyone who has any other questions we didn't get to, you'll get a follow-up. Please reach out to your Sophos team. We would love to talk about any of this, love to talk about MDR. And I will say thank you. And Taylor, I think handing it back to you if there's any other housekeeping. There might not be any other housekeeping. So I will do my best Taylor impression. Don't worry, I'm not going to try the Canadian accent there. Thanks again, everybody. We are recording this session. You'll get a copy of the recording. And as I say, reach out to the team. And lastly, again, Fraser, thank you so much. This was a really great session. And we will see everybody soon on the next AMA. Thanks, everybody.